Okay. Uh, so, just a minute. Yeah. So, good evening and welcome to our today's session. Hello, speakers. And I'm Somava Basu, President and founder of the Council for Global Cooperation. Uh, for our viewers, today our session is a book discussion on a recently published book, Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture, edited by Matthew Costello and Lindsay Chervinsky. Mourning the Presidents, published from University of Virginia Press in February 2023, happens to be a dozen chapter edited volume covering a very interesting theme. We have often seen research on US presidents, their time in office, their decision makings and policy. But this book researches US presidential legacies, how US presidents are remembered after their death, and how their legacy and memory politics flow in American culture. With 12 excellent scholars, this book offers chapters on George Washington to George H.W. Bush, analyzing how American society experiences presidential death, period of mourning and memorialization that follows. And for today's discussion, we have with us the book's co-editor, Professor Matthew Costello, and two of its contributing authors, Professor David Woolner and Professor Chester Patch. I am pleased to welcome you all. Before we start our today's session, I would like to briefly introduce our speakers. Professor Matthew Costello, who would be our first speaker, is the Vice President of the David M. Rubenstein National Center for White House History and a senior historian at the White House Historical Association. He completed his PhD and MA in American History at Marquette University. He received his BA in History and Political Science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He previously worked on the George Washington Bibliography Project for the George Washington Papers at the University of Virginia. He received research fellowships from Marquette University, the Virginia Historical Society, the United States Capitol Historical Society, and many more. He has published articles in different journals, and his book, The Property of the Nation, George Washington's Tomb, Mount Vernon, and the Memory of the First President, was published by University Press of Kansas in fall 2019 and was a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. Professor Costello is an adjunct faculty at the American University, where he teaches a course on White House history. Then we have with us our second speaker, Professor David Woolner, who is a professor of history at Marist College, senior fellow and resident historian of the Roosevelt Institute, and senior fellow of the Center for Civic Engagement at Bard College. He is the author of The Last 100 Days, FDR at War and at Peace, and is editor and co-editor of 5 books, including Progressivism in America, Past, Present, and Future, FDR's World, and FDR, the Vatican, and the Roman Catholic Church in America. Professor Woolner, as you can get it, is a scholar on President Roosevelt and a frequent commentator at different news channels and journals. He served as historical advisor to Ken Burns' films, The Roosevelts, An Intimate History, and the US and the Holocaust, for numerous special exhibitions at the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. He is a member of several institutions and has served as the Roosevelt Institute's executive director from 2000 to 2010. And finally, we have with us our last speaker, Professor Chester Patch. Professor Patch is the associate professor in the Department of History at Ohio University. He specializes in the history of US foreign relations and recent US history. His research has focused on US involvement in the Cold War and Vietnam War, as well as the Eisenhower, Johnson, and Reagan presidencies. He has a particular interest in television coverage of international issues and the intersection between politics, popular culture, and international history. He's the author and or editor of 4 books, namely A Companion to Dwight D. Eisenhower, Among the Free World, and the Johnson Years. He's currently writing a book on President Ronald Reagan. Thank you so much for joining us, and it is our great privilege to have all three of you here. Without further delays, I would like to pass on the floor to Professor Matthew Costello for a brief overview of this book, and further, we are eagerly waiting to know how this unique project topic came to your mind. So over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Soma, for having us all. It's a pleasure to be here, and for anybody who's watching now or will watching later on this recorded session, it's great to share this research with all of you. I serve as one of the co-editors of the volume, along with my colleague, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. And when this project first came together, it really began to take off in the aftermath of the passing of George H.W. Bush in late 2018. And as everybody remembers, it was very interesting, the conversation, the discourse that was swirling around the legacy of George H.W. Bush. He had been out of office now since 1993. Obviously, he had gone on and had a fairly successful post-presidential career, and continuing to work with the George Barber Bush Foundation, fundraising for a variety of different causes. But also our political landscape had changed pretty dramatically since he left office in 1993. And that exchange, seeing those types of tributes and those eulogies and those commentaries about George H.W. Bush, we thought begged this really interesting question about what can we learn about presidential mourning, both from and what do those changes tell us about not only the individual, but also society? What does that tell us about how Americans view their leaders, or how Americans think they should view their leaders? What is the proper way to commemorate and celebrate leaders? It's something that I think our country has long struggled with, being born out of a colony and then having to sort of invent these different traditions and rituals along the way. And it's been part of the American experiment, but also Americans in turn as citizens have had to learn how to navigate, those guardrails of, what is acceptable or suitable in a republic versus, what is acceptable or suitable in a monarchy. So I was one of the co-editors. I also wrote the chapter on Theodore Roosevelt. Here you can see on this slide, this is a picture of Christchurch in Oyster Bay. I know we're going to be talking about two Roosevelts today. This is the Oyster Bay branch. Obviously, a bit of competition there between them and Hyde Park, but I'm sure David will elaborate a little bit more on that. Theodore Roosevelt was a larger-than-life figure. For most American presidents throughout the 19th century, they would ascend to the office. They would step back from the political scene, and most of them did not go on to have much of a political career beyond that. Let alone, they pretty much kept to themselves. They maintained a private life. Theodore Roosevelt was not that way. In fact, quite the opposite. I mean, he really was the first former American president, with the exception of probably Ulysses S. Grant, who goes on a world tour, to really, seek out these audiences abroad. And maybe in part it's because of his thirst for knowledge. Maybe it's in part because he's thinking about a potential White House run in 1920. Who knows? Because Roosevelt passes away in 1919. But even before then, he doesn't leave the public sphere. I mean, he's very critical of Woodrow Wilson. He's very critical of Wilson's policies, especially as the United States appears to be heading toward a declaration of war in World War I. He even tries to volunteer to sign up to serve, which he's denied. So Roosevelt is never very far from the scene of American civic and political life. And so his passing really is, in many ways, even though he's not in office, he's not the sitting president of the United States, you see commemorations and celebrations across the country for the passing of a former president of the United States. And this, to me, very much resembles more of sort of what we're accustomed to seeing today. Americans really from all walks of life, or most walks of life, gathering to pay respects to a former president. I mean, that's something I think we've become much more accustomed to. especially post 1963 when the last sitting president was killed in office. And what I learned in doing this research was that Roosevelt was very, very particular about how he wanted to be remembered. He made it very clear that he didn't want any type of statues, which I think was fascinating, because then all these individuals and groups get into all these different debates and arguments about, should there be a statue? Well, what should it look like? They immediately sort of go back on that one wish that President Theodore Roosevelt had expressed for. When he dies, the historic sites that are associated with Theodore Roosevelt don't exist. Sagamore Hill is still owned by the Roosevelt family. In fact, Edith Roosevelt will continue living in it for about another 30 years. She doesn't pass away until the late 1940s. And even then, it eventually finds its way to the Theodore Roosevelt Association and then the National Park Service. So Americans don't really have a place to go to. His birthplace was actually demolished in 1916. So there's a group of private individuals that hire an architect to rebuild his birthplace and childhood home. So yes, the one that you visit in Manhattan is actually a reconstruction of a historic site. It is not the actual historic site. But what do all of these things tell us? Well, that Americans, especially wealthier individuals and private organizations with significant amounts of money and resources and connections, really jumped at the opportunity to not only commemorate and celebrate Roosevelt, but also to really align themselves with Roosevelt's image. Now, most people seem to forget in this time period that Roosevelt had run against his own party and torpedoed the incumbent Republican president and cost him a re-election opportunity. It's amazing how quickly the right and conservatives and Republicans leave that to the side because they want to rebrand Roosevelt as a Republican champion. And I think for decades that was the case. But what's really interesting is we're now seeing a new turn in Roosevelt's legacy with the creation of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library out in the Dakotas. And what we're starting to see now is a Roosevelt that has sort of his feet in both camps. There's a Roosevelt that everybody can seem to find something to admire about. And some of the big guiding principles that they're using at the library are conservation and citizenship, and so these broader ideas that you can get people from the left and from the right to align with, and so it's interesting to see how he was a progressive. The party dies away. When he passes away, he is a Republican. He stays a staunch Republican through most of the 20th century. But now what we're seeing, and in fact, this is some of the language that has been using, that Theodore Roosevelt, is sort of setting the stage for what would become arguably the other famous Roosevelt, some of the ideas and some of the policies. So it's really interesting to see this change in discourse of how people remember Roosevelt and how these new entities are adding to that conversation and sort of pivoting Roosevelt away from being more of a conservative Republican. And I think that's a good segue into my colleague David's presentation. We'll talk a little bit more about Franklin Roosevelt.
Well, thank you, Matt. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm going to do the same and share my screen. I do have a few slides, so let me go ahead and set that up. All right, and we should have it now. I trust you can see that. All right. So yeah, I'd like to again extend my thanks to both you, Matt, and to Linda Chervinsky for inviting me to be a part of this project. I really enjoyed working on this, and it's been an honor to be working with colleagues like Chester in recalling the legacy of these individuals. As most people know, it was roughly 70 years ago that Franklin Roosevelt passed away in the little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia, on April 12, 1945. He had gone there to kind of on what we might think of as a kind of working vacation during Easter time. He'd often go to Warm Springs in Easter to get some rest. And he did so this time again to quit the frantic environment of Washington and retreat to this relative isolation of rural Georgia so that he might recover his strength after this 14,000-mile trip that he had taken to Yalta and the hectic schedule he'd maintained since his return from the Crimea. By this point, of course, FDR's health was a major concern among those who were closest to him. Roughly a year earlier, a team of physicians had discovered that the president was suffering from severe hypertension and the early stages of congestive heart failure, and deeply alarmed, of course, by this. And unwilling to make the news public, they prescribed digitalis, a low-fat diet, ordered him to reduce his smoking to 6 cigarettes per day, and insisted that he avoid stress and significantly cut the hours he worked, which is not an easy thing to do for a president in the midst of a global war. For a time during the election campaign, Roosevelt seemed to regain his strength in the fall of 1944, but his health remained a serious concern for all of those who were closest to him, his family and inner circle. And like the president, they shared the hope, or I would say the illusion, that a few weeks spent in Warm Springs would give him the time he needed to what they called bounce back, as they'd seen him do so many times before when he was tired. And I think this slide kind of shows you how gaunt and tired the president looks. So sadly, of course, it was not to be. After a morning reading the papers, taking his breakfast in bed, getting dressed, and then working through his correspondence with his official secretary, his name was William Hassett, Roosevelt remarked that he had a, quote, terrific pain in the back of his head, and then suddenly slumped forward unconscious. Roughly 2 hours later, his heart stopped, and in spite of all the valiant efforts of the 2 physicians that were there to revive him, he was pronounced dead at 3:35 p.m. Central Wartime. Now, of course, the death of a leader always comes as a shock. But in this case, you had the most powerful man in the world dying in the midst of a global war. And it really was a tremendous shock. Hence, the first thing we got to consider when we think about the impact of FDR's death is that shock, not only among the American people, but also among the broader world community. And to fully understand why FDR's death proved so significant, I think we have to recall that he had been a very unusual president, the only president to serve for 12 years. For many Americans, especially those in uniform, this meant that FDR was, in some respects, the only president they'd really known. This was also the president that had steered the nation through the 2 great crises of the 20th century, the Great Depression and the Second World War. And of course, we must also remember that Franklin Roosevelt, like Abraham Lincoln, was a war president, the commander-in-chief at a time when more than 16 million American men and women were under arms, and when virtually every family in the nation was touched in some way by the gargantuan struggle that the United States and its allies were engaged in the struggle against fascism. Finally, of course, we must not overlook the extent to which FDR's efforts to prove to the American people that he possessed the energy and vitality to lead the nation through these trying times affected the public's perception of this highly unusual president. As I said, the only man to be elected to the White House 4 times, and the only president who could not stand or walk or get out of bed in the morning without the assistance of others. Now, this is not to say that the public was totally unaware that FDR had a disability. They knew that his, quote, legs were not much good to him, quote unquote, as a team of his sympathetic physicians reported at the start of the 1932 campaign. But his exuberant personality and determination to do whatever it took to get the nation out of the Great Depression convinced most Americans that FDR was a man of action, a leader who could race against speeding trains or jump across the Grand Canyon, as he was frequently portrayed in cartoons. Here you have this slide of FDR dragging Congress behind him at the opening of his first term during the 100 days. And then on the left, the only unabashed photograph that was ever taken of FDR in his wheelchair, taken by his friend Daisy Suckley in 1944. So, given the vitality that he possessed and the public's perception of that vitality, the possibility that FDR might leave the world stage at the very moment in which the most terrible war in human history had reached its climax seemed utterly impossible. yeah, I think even to those in their heart of hearts that knew that FDR was essentially a dying man. So the second factor I think we must consider is the relationship about his legacy, is the relationship that he had developed with the American people. I took a moment in preparing for this talk to look at the condolence letters that Eleanor Roosevelt received after Roosevelt's death in the FDR library. And it's quite amazing to read them. Most of the letters spoke of the very personal relationship the authors felt that they had with the president, even though they'd never met him or only seen FDR from a distance. There were letters from elementary school children, from members of the military, anonymous letters signed from, quote, ordinary citizens of the United States, letters that were signed, quote, from an American family, from a Negro soldier, and a very moving letter from a young woman who had contracted polio at the age of 7 and had struggled to walk, but had been sent by her parents to Vassar College and managed to get through college, but was very embarrassed by her difficulty walking and was really dreading her graduation day. And then looked up and noticed that it was Franklin Roosevelt who was giving the graduation address. This was when he was governor in 1931. And she said she watched in sort of utter shock when he made his way to the podium to speak. And she said, having watched him complete that journey, it really changed her life. And this, of course, would be the typical situation that Roosevelt was in. You can see him there holding himself up with the podium that is designed to kind of support his weight. And if you look at Roosevelt when he's speaking, he's always holding on to something when he's speaking. So it's a quite an extraordinary story. So as the journalist Bill Moyers wrote in the wonderful tribute he penned to FDR some years after he died, after Roosevelt died, people like his father really felt that they had a friend in the White House with the president. His death then came as a tremendous shock, as you can see from his photographs of the people lining Pennsylvania Avenue. And here, I think this most striking image of Graham Jackson playing Going Home on April 13th, 1944, as FDR's hearse made its way out of Warm Springs. And you can see the patients at Warm Springs lined up in their wheelchairs, paying tribute to their fallen hero. When I look at that picture of Chief Petty Officer Jackson, you get the sense that he had not just lost his president, he had lost a friend, a man who, in spite of his privileged upbringing, seemed to understand the troubles and aspirations of every American, no matter what their status, race, or creed. And I think what makes this bond all the more remarkable is that it came about in an era when much of the rest of the world had turned its back on democracy and instead embraced the tenets of fear of the other, fear of the unknown, fear that led millions to embrace what FDR sometimes called the ideology of hate, fear that led to the most destructive war and unspeakable crimes in human history. And from the moment Roosevelt took the oath of office, he made clear that his goal was not to embrace fear, but of course to banish it, to overcome the, quote, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror brought on by the Great Depression. Terror, as he said, that paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. And I find this use of the word paralyzed in this instance very interesting and very significant. It's almost as if this paralyzed president was tasked with this task of restoring a paralyzed nation from its great moment of peril. And then finally, I think the third factor we must consider about how the timing of his death affected his legacy is important. The moment that he died, just weeks before the end of the war before the end of the victory in Europe. I opened the chapter with a quote from Stephen Early, who wrote this about a month after Roosevelt died. He said that important individuals, great leaders, have two lives, one which occurs while they're on Earth, and the second which begins the day of their death and continues as long as our ideas remain possible. I think Early's observation here raises a number of important questions. Very few people would disagree, I think, that FDR's vision and ideas granted him a powerful, quote, second life, unquote. But I also think Winston Churchill was correct in his observation, which he gave during the moving eulogy that he delivered in the House of Commons a few days after FDR died. Churchill said that FDR's death, of course, represented, quote, a bitter loss to humanity. But at the same time, Churchill said he felt that the president had died what he called an enviable death. He had brought his country, he said, through the worst of its perils and heaviest of toils, and had died in harness, battle harness, like his soldiers, sailors, and airmen, at the very moment when victory had cast its sure and steady beam upon him. Quite moving. Churchill, of course, was not alone in this observation. Dozens of editorials and press pieces and radio broadcasts made the same argument. So did Benjamin Cohen, which is very interesting. Cohen was the only official within the Roosevelt administration who had the temerity to actually suggest that Roosevelt should not run for a fourth term. He said he feared that it meant that Rooseveltian ideas like Wilsonian ideas might become discredited for a considerable period, not because they are basically unsound, but because political conditions will not permit them to be accepted or even understood. If, on the other hand, FDR were to end his career in 1944 in what could only be described as a high point, the influence of his ideas may be greater, Cohen said or wrote, as people will always remember that at no moment and in no crisis did Roosevelt ever let them down. We don't know what would happen, of course, if FDR had lived even a few months longer, and I'd happy to speculate about this in the question and answer period. But I think there's no question that his timing, the timing of his death, had a profound impact on his legacy. Finally, I just quickly mentioned that the one person who really addressed this issue was an editorialist at the New York Times, Anne O'Hare McCormick, who just a few weeks after his death directly addressed this question. She published a very interesting editorial called His Unfinished Business and Ours. And it was based on a very extraordinary interview that she'd held with the president just a few weeks before he died. She said that many people, of course, would argue that Roosevelt died when his, quote, great work was done. But he would not have said so, she said, because the president was looking beyond victory to the meeting that was to take place in San Francisco, where the nations of the world were to set the final draft of the United Nations. She reported that she found the president's normally discursive mind singularly focused on the United Nations and the inaugural conference that should take place in San Francisco to put it together. She said all his hopes of success in life and immortality in history were set on getting the International Security Organization in motion. She talked about his sense of urgency and wanting to get this moving while the alliance was still in place. And she closed by saying, the San Francisco conference is the unfinished business of the Roosevelt administration. FDR may not be present at the conclave, he called, but in the most literal sense, he will be most conspicuous by his absence. His voice will be the loudest there. His vacant seat will overshadow all the occupied chairs. It may well be, she concluded, that the speech he does not deliver, the speech that was in his mind when he fell, will be far more effective in carrying his dream towards reality than anything he could say in person. And of course, the United Nations remains the great legacy of Franklin Roosevelt. And when we think back on this generation, I think there's much we can learn from the generation that lived through the Depression and war, about how to restore the environment, about how to promote and preserve democracy in a world that is under increasing threat from autocracy, and about how we might reinvigorate such key institutions as the United Nations at a time when basic human rights are undergoing a test unlike any we have seen since 1945. And while the winds of time have certainly shifted our perception of this remarkable president, shifts that we can address in our question and answer period today, there can be little doubt that FDR's unfinished business in establishing the United Nations and in bringing about a world founded on what he called his basic four freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, remains our business as well. Thank you very much, and let me turn it over to Chester.
Good evening or good morning, depending on where you are and when you're watching this event. I want to thank the organizers who've given us the opportunity to present our research and writing. I want to thank Matt and Lindsay for giving me the chance to contribute to this volume. And I want to thank the contributors, some of whom I knew before I wrote this essay and some of whom I've gotten to meet as a result of it. And it's always nice to expand professional contacts in that way. I wrote the chapter about Ronald Reagan, and one of the ways that Reagan was different in terms of the theme of this volume was that Reagan made two dramatic exits from public life, not just one at the end of his life. He died on June 5th, 2004 at the age of 93. But almost 10 years earlier, on November 5th, 1994, Reagan announced that he was suffering from Alzheimer's disease and was retiring from public life. If I can try to share my screen, I want to show you the letter that Ronald Reagan shared with the American people. Let me go back to, for some reason, it's not showing, showing the wrong slide here. Let me try this once more. For some reason, the PowerPoint is not showing the correct slide. Let me try to do that once more if I can. All right, give me one more second if I can. Okay, let me try it now once more. Well, I guess you're not seeing the slide, I guess, is that correct?
We're
Okay.
seeing Reagan's letter to the American people, November 5th, 1994.
Okay, you are seeing that. Okay, it wasn't showing that to me, and so I didn't know that. Okay, if you're seeing that, that's a letter that Reagan shared with the American people when he announced that he was suffering from Alzheimer's disease. And many people saw that letter exactly as Reagan wrote it, and you can see it's in his own hand. It was printed in many newspapers that Sunday. It was released on a Saturday. Reagan's letter really touched the American people. He thanked the American people for the honor of serving as president. In addition, Reagan looked ahead to the future of the United States and thought it was bright. And that was one reason that so many people liked Ronald Reagan, that he was optimistic. They might not have liked some of his policies, but they liked him and they liked his optimism which always seemed to show through even at the darkest moments at this juncture in his life. He wrote, "I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead." There was an outpouring of praise for Reagan's courage and candor in announcing his condition at a time when millions of Americans also suffered from Alzheimer's disease. And one of the things that Reagan hoped to do was raise awareness about the disease. The disease, though, is just unspeakably cruel. And in my chapter, I wrote about how it compressed the circles of Reagan's life during the last 9.5 years that he lived. He had to restrict his activities. He had a ranch near Santa Barbara that he loved to visit. He stopped going there. He could no longer ride the horses on the ranch, and that was one of the reasons he always liked to visit. He stopped going to his office, which was near his home in Los Angeles. That became too much of a trial. But only family members got to see how Alzheimer's changed Reagan as he gradually became unaware of almost everything around him. By the time of his last 2 years of life, his wife, Nancy, doubted that he knew who she was. And so the disease robbed him of all his memories. He didn't even realize that he had been president of the United States. Throughout his last years, there were many people who praised Reagan, and he became an object of, in some cases, bipartisan praise because of his candor in announcing his diagnosis of Alzheimer's. In 1994, Bill Clinton was president, and Clinton applauded Reagan and praised him not only for talking about the disease, but for his service. Reagan spent the last 3 years of his life confined to a hospital bed in his home. He suffered a broken hip, and that restricted his life even more. He lived to be the oldest ex-president in American history up to that point. He died at age 93 on June 5th, 2004. There was no surprise about his death. He had obviously been ill for almost a decade. So there was no shock when the death was announced. For some people, of course, there was sadness and there were tears shed, but not the shock that came when, say, Lincoln or Kennedy was shot. And for some people, there was a kind of relief, too, that he was no longer suffering from that cruel disease, and that Nancy Reagan, who became his primary caregiver, no longer had the responsibility of caring for him and the burdens that came with it. Like most presidents at that time, Reagan had an elaborate funeral plan. It was 300 pages long. It was known as the book. Reagan had helped shape it. He had been contributing to it from the time that he was in the White House, but others, of course, had a role in it. His wife, Nancy, especially as the years went by. One of the things he wanted was for there to be a bagpiper playing. Can you see the bagpiper slide? Yes? Okay. For some reason, this is just not showing me what you're seeing, so that's why I'm asking. And you see the bagpiper here at the final segment of his funeral services, which occurred at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California. Point I made in my chapter was that this funeral was planned to shape the legacy of Ronald Reagan. One of Reagan's White House aides who was involved in planning the event, but mostly in carrying it out, said this. He said, "This is a legacy building event. The goal was to evoke the rugged individual spirit of Ronald Reagan, his ideas of limited government, and to say to the world that Ronald Reagan has gone home." So it was an elaborate plan. And for almost a week, Ronald Reagan dominated American TV news, especially on the TV news channels, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. They did sort of almost 24/7 coverage of Ronald Reagan for several days. This was a funeral that spanned the country. It began in California, went to Washington, D.C. for a state funeral, and then back again to California for his burial on the grounds of the Reagan Library. So all of this was planned in advance, and I hope you can see here a photo of his widow, Nancy Reagan, saying goodbye to him at the Reagan Library. And her dignity and her grief, but her remarkable self-control too was quite moving throughout the many scenes of this funeral. But despite all the calculation that went into the funeral, there was spontaneous popular outpouring of emotion on the part of millions of Americans for Ronald Reagan. Hope you see here the slide of Reagan lying in state at the Capitol Rotunda. And for more than a day and a half, hundreds of thousands of Americans filed by his casket in order to say goodbye to Ronald Reagan. And for many people, what Ronald Reagan represented was sort of their notion of what it meant to be American in the late 20th century, early 21st century. One mourner said, "When I think of Ronald Reagan, I think of America. He represented what this country is all about." So there was a kind of symbolic dimension to Ronald Reagan. More than his policies, people thought about Reagan and what he represented about the country's values, or what they thought the country's values should be. Culmination of the funeral, the last act of it occurred with his burial on the grounds of the Reagan Library at sunset on Friday, June 11th. This is Ron Reagan delivering a eulogy for his father. And by this time, the speeches were very personal. They weren't about Reagan's policies. They were about Reagan the man, not Reagan the president. So I hope I'll be able here to share with you a screen in which I show an excerpt from Ron Reagan delivering that funeral eulogy, or part of it. So let me try to do that if I can.
He is home now. He is free. In his final letter to the American people, Dad wrote, "I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. This evening, he has arrived. History will record his worth as a leader. We here have long since measured his worth as a man. Honest, compassionate, graceful, brave. He was the most plainly decent man you could ever hope to meet. He used to say, 'A gentleman always does the kind thing.' And he was a gentleman in the truest sense of the word, a gentle man. The idea that all people are created equal was more than mere words on a page. It was how he lived his life. And he lived a good, long life. The kind of life good men lead. But I guess I'm just telling you things you already know. Here's something you may not know. Little Ronald Reagan trivia for you. His entire life, Dad had an inordinate fondness for earlobes. Even as a boy, back in Dixon, Illinois, hanging out on a street corner with his friends, they knew that if they were standing next to Dutch, sooner or later, he was going to reach over and grab a hold of their lobe, give it a workout. There, sitting on his lap watching TV as a kid, same story. He'd have a hold of my earlobe. I'm surprised I have any lobes left. Dad was also a deeply, unabashedly religious man. But he never made the fatal mistake of so many politicians, wearing his faith on his sleeve to gain political advantage. True, after he was shot and nearly killed early in his presidency, he came to believe that God had spared him in order that he might do good. But he accepted that as a responsibility, not a mandate. And there is a profound difference. Humble as he was, he never would have assumed a free pass to heaven. But in his heart of hearts, I suspect he felt he would be welcome there. And so he is home. He is free. Those of us who knew him well will have no trouble imagining his paradise. Golden fields will spread beneath the blue dome of a western sky. Live oaks will shadow the rolling hillsides. And someplace, flowing from years long past, a river will wind towards the sea. Across those fields, he will ride a gray mare he calls Nancy D. They will sail over jumps he has built with his own hands. He will let the river carry him over the shining stones. He will rest in the shade of the trees. Our cares are no longer his. We meet him now only in memory, but we will join him soon enough, all of us, when we are home, when we are free.
I think that touching excerpt from Ron Reagan's remembrance of his father gives you a sense of how this televised funeral, this funeral which was drew on so many images of the Reagan presidency, was about Reagan the man and what he seemed to represent to the American people. Reagan's death occurred at a time when his reputation among historians was on the upswing and had been for a while. Reagan was generally a popular president while in the White House. There were some moments where his approval rating sank during the recession in 1981, 1982, during the Iran-Contra scandal. But he was always a polarizing figure too. There were some people, for example, who deplored his cuts in social welfare, who criticized him for Iran-Contra, and historians generally divided about his reputation, some considering him one of the worst presidents of the 20th century, or maybe of all American history, others considering him a great hero. After he left the White House, so his reputation, while again, there was controversy over it, generally improved. And there were even historians who disliked his policies, who recognized his influence on public events. Sean Wilentz, who's a liberal historian and generally critical of many of Reagan's policies, wrote a book called The Age of Reagan, because Reagan was such a dominant figure. And so this funeral event, I think, helped to raise Reagan's reputation even more. By the time of the centennial of his birth in 2011, Reagan had become a figure who both Democrats and Republicans could invoke. They could find parts of his legacy that they both thought were a representative of the parts of the American past that they thought were good, and would invoke him when it was politically convenient. So Ronald Reagan said that he lived an American life. That was the name of his memoir. He did live it, but he continued to live it after his death. And Ronald Reagan, in many ways, has entered a kind of American political pantheon now. He's certainly not beyond criticism, but his reputation may be higher, in part because of the way he left this world than it ever has been before. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, speakers, for your wonderful presentations and the lectures that you presented before us. So now we can have a short discussion, and we will limit to very few questions. So my first question would be to Professor Costello regarding the book. We have seen that the mentioning of race has been a very prominent factor in your book when it comes to the presidents and commemoration and memorializing. Race we have seen as a very important factor. So why is it a very important factor that you have chosen in your books? If you could briefly tell to our viewers, yes.
Sure. So, I mentioned that the passing of George H.W. Bush was a big catalyst for this volume coming together. But as Chester and David know, then we got delayed, we got sidetracked by COVID. And then the United States and the rest of the world went through the protests of 2020, where all of a sudden now it's in plain sight, and people are having real-time conversations about things like police brutality, the killing of unarmed Black men, Black women, and historians then sort of are drawn into the fray as well, because everybody is talking about race, not just contemporary politics, but what is the relationship between American presidents and race, where presidents stood on things like civil rights, Jim Crow, Reconstruction, all these different moments in American history. And I think up to this point in time, there had been quite a bit said about presidents who were enslavers, presidents who owned people who would go on to become president of the United States, or brought enslaved people with them to the White House, or continued owning people after. But I think that is very much a reflection of the moment. And one of the other things I tell people is that, a volume of essays of different scholars will also reflect the time period when it is written. And so I think for all of us, race was especially apparent because that was a big part of our national discourse in 2020 and 2021. And for me, my chapter on Theodore Roosevelt, the statue of Theodore Roosevelt outside the museum in New York became a flashpoint, not only before 2020, but in 2020. And now it has been loaned to the new Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library for its depiction of Roosevelt with an African man and a Native American man. And, one of the things I think I would want people to take away from this is that the relationship between presidents and race has been very complicated and complex. However, we have to be critical of these decisions and of some of these policies. And Roosevelt, like Reagan, and like FDR, I think people wanted him to do more on these things, and for a variety of different reasons and different rationalizations, he made his decisions as he did. So race has been central, I think, to this conversation about the founding of the United States, the creation of the United States, and it's been there. And I think bringing it into the limelight of this conversation about presidents and legacy is also a reflection of what we were going through as a country at the time.
Okay. And we have in your book, we have like for the President Kennedy, and there are a few more presidents where we have seen like their role in office were very critical. Like, say, for example, the case of Kennedy, if we pick up the Camelot and other approvals were very low when it comes to Kennedy. But yet after his death, we have seen that Kennedy has been often considered as one of the ideal president in US history. So my question is, in what respect these changes had occurred? Is there any political parties, the political party from which President Kennedy belonged, had any role in this, or is it completely memory politics that always emerge like this? Yeah.
I think I'll defer to either David or Chester to take that one.
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting, going back to the question of race, and the question of legacy and the question of historians, there's a kind of tension between the historical record on the one hand and the public's kind of political perception at the time. There is this problem that we all face of what was considered acceptable behavior and attitudes 100 years ago or 50 years ago or even 20 years ago is very different than what it is today. And I think one of the things that I find very interesting is the chapter on Kennedy, because President Kennedy was actually not as forthright vis-a-vis race as President Johnson, and yet Kennedy, according to the author of the chapter, which is a very well done chapter, the African American community, because of a speech that he gave near the end of his life, really saw him as a kind of champion of the civil rights movement. And with respect to Roosevelt, you have a similar situation in the sense that on the one hand, the public's perception is that Roosevelt was rather lackluster and should have done more with vis-a-vis race. But on the other hand, if you go into the details of the kind of confrontation that he confronted in Congress with these very bigoted Southern Democratic congressmen, racist congressmen, that, you know, we always forget in today's context that the Democratic Party was the party of the Ku Klux Klan. The Democratic Party is the party of white supremacy. And those white supremacists really dominated the US Congress. So his field of operation was really limited. And in spite of that, you know, he creates an environment during his time in office in which, as Mayor McLeod Bethune said, you know, this is the first time since Reconstruction that the African-American community felt there was an administration in Washington that listened to their concerns with sympathy and understanding. So it is a kind of monumental shift in some respects in the position of race in US history that occurs during the New Deal years. But it's largely sort of hidden from public view because of issues like the question of whether or not he could have pushed through an anti-lynching bill and things like that. So these stories are often more complex than we, you know, Theodore Roosevelt invited a black man to the White House to have dinner. And the press reporting, as Matt will tell you, was outrageous. You know, how dare he do this? So we, you know, sometimes you have leaders whose private attitudes, or President Reagan's attitude about religions, another good one, where their private attitudes are perhaps more progressive or more compatible, shall we say, with the worldview we have today than we realize. But because of the political dynamics of the time, they can't act on them as they might have done. So there's always this tension. And that's not to say that they don't deserve criticism. Obviously, many times they do. But it's the historical context is very important to keep in mind, not as an excuse, but to understand the dynamic of race and how important it is in American history.
Yeah, can I just add to that briefly? Writing about Reagan and teaching about Kennedy, I teach courses on the 1960s and post-World War II America. I'm struck by how much our memory and our image of presidents is shaped by visual culture, the image that presidents create, and the words that they use and how effectively they're able to use them. So, you know, my students think, as most of the American public does, actually very favorably about Kennedy, despite the shortcomings of some of his policies, the timidity he showed for a long time in dealing with civil rights, because he was charismatic, because he and his wife were stylish, because they were glamorous, because they were almost a kind of American royalty, and sometimes consciously so. One could say that, well, Kennedy faced real political problems as a Democrat in trying to take strong positions about civil rights. There was a real high political cost to pay, but ultimately, in June of 1963, he was the first president who ever said publicly that civil rights was a moral issue, not just a political issue or a constitutional issue, but a moral issue. So we can say that ultimately he was moving in the right direction, or he learned over time, or had more courage than he showed earlier on. Ronald Reagan, in many ways, was not very progressive at all on civil rights. In fact, many people would think he was reactionary. He said he, you know, had grown up in a family where bigotry wasn't tolerated, and from all we know, that's certainly true, but he was not willing to move aggressively to enforce civil rights laws. There were some people who thought that the United States had moved too far too quickly, and the 1980s was a time of slowing down or even backlash. When I wrote about Reagan's funeral, though, what I was amazed about was how few people of color play prominent roles in either talking about Reagan's legacy, or the number of people who showed up in the crowds were, you know, very few people of color. It was overwhelmingly white, and commentators didn't say too much about that. Yeah, there was some talk about his deficiencies in civil rights, but, you know, this conversation that about Reagan's death that occurred almost 20 years ago really does seem to have come from a very different era compared to what the discourse that we're used to now.
Yeah, and I think back to David's point, Roosevelt does invite Booker T. Washington to the White House. He doesn't apologize for it, but he also doesn't do it again. I mean, he learns his lesson that it's just not worth, to him, it's not worth the political risk, the PR risk. And Roosevelt had this relationship with people of color that if he could see them beyond their skin for their individual achievement, things that they've done, their education, he seemed to be very collegial and friendly and willing to work with leaders, African-American leaders and leaders of color. But then you see some of the things that are written in the quotes. I mean, of course, him, like many Americans, had these racial prejudices, that, again, we can't escape that. That's just, that was the time. And I think David's other point, we can't disassociate the leader from the context in which they grow up in, and also the time that they're leading, right? The environment is very important. And so Roosevelt, what I wanted my chapter to also pick up on was Native Americans. That's not something that I think gets nearly as much attention. The variety of different issues affecting and impacting Native peoples in the United States. And I think Mount Rushmore, I talk about Mount Rushmore in the chapter. I mean, that is really sort of if you wanted a monument that sort of symbolizes this contestation of America, the founding, the leaders, race, I mean, it's Mount Rushmore. And Roosevelt's role, I mean, really sort of being out in the Dakotas. I mean, he's really the only one that I think has really a geographic claim to that space. And again, kind of coming over to Chester's point, how we view these accomplishments or these achievements. Well, oftentimes there's things that you can find, something positive, but you can also find negative outcomes, right? And so with Roosevelt, we often think of him using his presidential authority, his executive authority, to set aside millions of acres of federal land, making these movements to establish national monuments, later the national park system. But one of the things that I point out was, there were still people living in these places. So Roosevelt was using this authority to set aside these lands, but there were some people in some of these places still living there. And so when we talk about Roosevelt and Native Americans, this is not, that conversation doesn't end at colonization, right? It continues. And I think many Americans sort of drop the story, at colonization and contact, and they sort of forget that there's this entire group in a variety of different nations and peoples and tribes that still exist today that continue to be impacted by American expansionism to the 19th and into the 20th century.
Thank you so much, Professor. And so we are almost at the end of our session. So this would be the last question I would like to ask Professor Woolner and Professor Patch. So this is regarding FDR and Reagan. So both are international figures, and both their presidencies were related to the Cold War era, very important phase of the Cold War era. So how their death, when President FDR died, how was it memorialized beyond the Iron Curtain in Soviet Union or the Eastern European states? And similarly for Reagan, it was obviously the Cold War was over, but how did the Eastern European states, which were once under the Iron Curtain, view these two figures after deaths?
Well, if we go in chronology, I guess I should answer that question first.
Sure.
Roosevelt was deeply admired and is still deeply admired by the people of the Soviet Union and now the people of Russia. Because of his leadership during the war, because of Lend-Lease, because of all of the efforts that he made to support the Russians in their struggle against Germany, against fascism. He was deeply, deeply respected. And at the time of his death, it was the first time that the Soviet press had featured a foreign leader with the kind of respect that he was granted, in the weeks immediately following his death. And even Premier Stalin was completely shocked, of course, when Ambassador Harriman told him about his death. And at that moment in their relationship, there was a very bitter period, the most bitter period between Stalin and Roosevelt over various issues that were taking place during World War II. And as a consequence of that tension, Stalin had decided not to send his foreign secretary to the United Nations conference in San Francisco, which deeply offended Roosevelt. And Roosevelt felt this will send a signal that the Russians are not really interested in the United Nations. And when Harriman told Stalin that Roosevelt had died, Stalin asked Harriman what he could do to kind of show his respect for the former president. And Harriman said that he should send Molotov, the foreign secretary, to San Francisco. And Stalin immediately agreed, and he actually said, Roosevelt has died, but his cause must live on. So I think in many respects, he was, deeply admired. We'll never know. That's an unknown question, whether the Cold War would have developed the same way had Roosevelt been president in the months following. I do think things like Vietnam, I highly doubt the Vietnam War would have happened if President Roosevelt had lived through his entire term. But in general, he was a global figure and deeply admired by the people of Eastern Europe and deeply admired by the people of the Soviet Union. And again, I think that contributes to the shock, because people kind of trusted him and looked to him to kind of guide the world through this very difficult transition, and he wasn't there to do so.
If I could say just one quick thing about Roosevelt and Eastern Europe before I talk about Reagan. My family came from Poland. All my grandparents were born in what was Poland or Polish territory, even if there wasn't a Polish state. And I remember my paternal grandfather always used to tell me how much he disliked FDR and liked Harry Truman. And the reason was that he thought that Roosevelt was not firm enough, tough enough in dealing with Stalin or preventing communists from taking control of the Polish government at the end of World War II, whereas Truman had stood up, even though he wasn't able to do anything about communist control of Poland, had spoken out more directly and forcefully than FDR. So I suppose maybe that's an example of Polish Americans rather than Eastern Europeans, but nonetheless, there can be that divided perception of FDR. As for Reagan,
I should have mentioned Poland. I was going to say, but I just didn't do so, that the one exception would be Poland.
Yeah. As for Reagan, of course, it's interesting which part of Reagan's dealing with the Cold War one wants to focus on. The early years where Reagan was talking very bluntly about an evil empire, or 5 years later when he was, shoulder to shoulder with Mikhail Gorbachev in Red Square and talking about the evil empire being part of another time, another era, which was 5 years earlier. And Ronald Reagan, I think, was instrumental in bringing the Cold War to an end. Gorbachev was the critical figure. I can't imagine the Cold War ending the way it did, or at the time it did, if someone like Chernenko or Brezhnev or Andropov had lived and remained in power. So Gorbachev was pivotal, but Reagan was a willing partner, somebody who was eager to negotiate, although the terms were usually American terms that he got, but someone who truly believed that he could negotiate with the Soviets, and did. And the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty is a good example of how that happened in 1987 to lower tensions. Reagan was also somebody who spoke out in favor of freedom wherever it was. He may have changed his tactics in dealing with the Soviets, but he never ceased detesting communism and never ceased calling for greater individual liberty in nations in Eastern Europe. And so, of course, he supported the Soviet dissidents who challenged Soviet rule. And there are many, of course, who valued that, who said that he helped create some space for them to be effective. I have friends who grew up in East Germany and who came to the United States in the 1990s after the Berlin Wall fell. And I still am close to them. I know their perspectives. One of my best friends told me they never imagined visiting the United States in their lifetime. They thought that would be like going to the moon. And so certainly Reagan's role in helping to end the Cold War and speaking out so strongly and consistently for freedom is something that has made him, an admirable figure in the eyes of many Eastern Europeans. I imagine, of course, that there are other views, that there are critics as well. But overall, I think Reagan's role in the Cold War has led to overall praise for him in Eastern Europe.
Thank you so much. It was a really wonderful discussion today. It was in the book. There are many precedents. I hope the viewers will definitely read this book and read the memorialization of different US presidents. But unfortunately, we couldn't call every authors. But yes, FDR and Reagan. It was a really interesting conversation which we had today. And thank you, professors, for joining us. It was really lovely evening today. Yeah.
Thank you. It's our
Thank you.
pleasure.
Thank you too.
Thank you for having us.